On February 17, 2026, Iran's Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei sat down and posted something on X that ended up getting viewed more than 3.5 million times within a day. He wrote, and this is the actual quote, "The Americans constantly say that they've sent a warship toward Iran. Of course, a warship is a dangerous piece of military hardware. However, more dangerous than that warship is the weapon that can send that warship to the bottom of the sea." He followed it up by warning that the strongest military force in the world may at times be struck so hard that it cannot get up again. That was Iran's supreme leader directly, personally, threatening to sink a United States aircraft carrier. At a moment when the USS Abraham Lincoln was already sailing off the coast of Oman and the USS Gerald Ford was steaming toward the region to join it. 11 days later, the man who made that threat was dead, killed in a coordinated American and Israeli strike that opened one of the most consequential wars this region has seen in decades. And what happened after that, the actual attempt to make good on that threat, turned out to be one of the strangest, most revealing episodes of the entire conflict. Let's actually walk through the sequence properly, because the timing here matters enormously. Khamenei's threat on February 17th didn't come out of nowhere. It came right in the middle of a very specific standoff. The United States had been massing what President Trump himself referred to as an armada in Middle Eastern waters, and diplomatic contacts over Iran's nuclear program were still technically ongoing, with a second round of indirect negotiations between American and Iranian delegations having just taken place at the Omani embassy in Geneva a few days earlier. Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi was telling state media at the time that Washington hadn't actually demanded a permanent halt to uranium enrichment, and that Tehran hadn't offered any suspension either, framing the talks as still being focused on keeping Iran's nuclear program peaceful in exchange for sanctions relief. So on paper, there was still a diplomatic track alive. But underneath that, the naval buildup kept intensifying, and Khamenei's response to it wasn't a diplomatic statement, it was a direct threat against a specific class of American military asset. 3 days after his post, an Iranian member of parliament, Amir Hayat Moghadam, who'd previously served as a commander in the Revolutionary Guard, went even further, telling a state-affiliated outlet that Iran possessed full capability to confront any American military threat, and that sinking a U.S. aircraft carrier in the event of war wasn't far-fetched at all. Now here's what makes this such a genuinely remarkable turn of events rather than just another round of tough talk in a long-running standoff. Just 11 days after Khamenei's own threat went viral, at around 12:53 in the afternoon on February 28th, the United States and Israel launched a coordinated strike operation that would come to be known as Operation Epic Fury. The opening salvo of that operation didn't target a warship. It targeted the very top of the Iranian regime itself, and it succeeded in killing Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, along with several senior Iranian officials in the process. Think about the symmetry of that for a second. The man who spent a viral social media post warning that America's strongest military force could be struck so hard it couldn't get back up again became, within less than 2 weeks, the single highest profile casualty of the war that followed. Whatever deterrent value the threat was supposed to carry evaporated the moment the man who made it was gone, and the regime he led was suddenly scrambling to reassert command and control while simultaneously trying to make good on the exact kind of retaliation its own leadership had just promised. And Iran didn't waste any time trying. Within the same window as that opening strike, Tehran launched a genuinely massive multi-day campaign of missile and drone attacks against American positions and allied countries across the region. Bahrain got hit hard, with strikes landing on multiple buildings in the capital city of Manama, including the Jafar district specifically, which happens to be where the U.S. Navy's 5th Fleet is headquartered at Naval Support Activity Bahrain. By mid-March, that specific campaign against Bahrain had produced 2 fatalities and more than 50 injuries. The United Arab Emirates absorbed an even heavier bombardment, with Iran launching wave after wave of ballistic missiles, drones, and cruise missiles at American installations there, including Al Dhafra Air Base outside Abu Dhabi. By early April, the UAE's own air defense systems, THAAD and Patriot batteries purchased from the United States, had intercepted and destroyed 537 ballistic missiles, 2,256 drone attacks, and 26 cruise missiles. Despite that defensive success, the attacks still managed to kill 13 people in the UAE alone, including 2 military personnel, a civilian contractor, and 10 other civilians, with 224 more injured ranging from minor to severe. One of the very first casualties came when debris from an intercepted missile fell into a residential area near Zayed International Airport, killing a Pakistani national and injuring 7 others from the shrapnel and blast. A grim reminder that even a successfully intercepted missile can still take an innocent life on the ground below. So Iran was clearly capable of launching an overwhelming, sustained barrage across multiple countries simultaneously. But here's where the story of the carrier threat specifically takes its strangest turn. On March 1st, just a day after the war's opening strikes, Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps announced that they had attacked and struck the USS Abraham Lincoln with ballistic missiles, directly fulfilling the exact threat Khamenei had made 2 weeks earlier. Social media exploded with footage supposedly showing the carrier on fire, with posts claiming Iran had fired 4 ballistic missiles at the ship while it sat in the Arabian Sea, racking up millions of views across platforms in multiple languages, shared in Malay, Burmese, French, Spanish, and Arabic. It looked for a moment like the threat had actually been carried out. It hadn't. U.S. Central Command responded almost immediately on X, stating plainly that the Lincoln was not hit, and that the missiles launched didn't even come close. Independent fact-checkers dug into the viral footage and found it was completely fabricated. One widely shared clip turned out to be old video game footage with visibly unrealistic elements, and another version of the same claim traced back to a completely unrelated video that had been circulating on Facebook since June of 2025, long before this war ever started. Iranian state television didn't let the story go quietly either, following up on March 5th with a fresh claim that drones fired by the Revolutionary Guards had struck the carrier, offering no actual evidence or details to back it up. Military analysts who looked closely at the entire episode, including a vice president at the Lexington Institute who specifically evaluated the Lincoln's defensive posture during those opening days, dismissed the whole thing as what she bluntly called a ludicrous fabrication, pointing out that the ship's own E-2D Hawkeye radar aircraft, combined with U.S. Space Force systems capable of detecting the heat signature of a ballistic missile launch the instant it happens, gave the carrier strike group more than enough warning to track and intercept anything Iran actually fired. It's worth understanding exactly why military experts were so confident dismissing that claim, because the reasoning tells you something important about the actual gap between Iran's rhetoric and its real capability. There's a genuinely instructive historical precedent here. Back in 2005, the U.S. Navy deliberately tried to sink one of its own retired carriers, the USS America, during a live fire exercise specifically designed to simulate underwater attacks and test how much punishment a supercarrier hull could actually absorb. Even with the full might of the U.S. Navy trying, on purpose over an extended test, to sink an unmanned, undefended, obsolete carrier, the word researchers use to describe that effort is attempted, because it took an extraordinary amount of ordnance and time to finally put that ship under. A modern nuclear-powered supercarrier like the Abraham Lincoln or the Gerald isn't just larger than its World War II-era predecessors. It's built with layered, redundant defensive systems, specifically designed around the assumption that someone, someday, is going to try exactly what Iran claimed it did. Between the escort destroyers running Aegis radar systems, the carrier's own airborne early warning aircraft, and space-based missile launch detection that starts tracking a threat before it's even finished leaving the launch pad, the odds of an unsophisticated ballistic missile strike actually connecting with a moving carrier group, let alone doing meaningful damage to the hull itself, are close to non-existent with the sensor and targeting technology Iran currently fields. And that's really the heart of the story here, because Iran's fixation on the carrier didn't end with that one embarrassing debunked claim in March. Nearly a month later, on March 29th, Iran's Navy chief, Shahram Irani, went on the record again, this time explicitly warning that the USS Abraham Lincoln would be targeted by the Islamic Republic if it ever came within range. That's a genuinely remarkable thing to say publicly, weeks after your own regime already claimed, falsely, to have already struck that exact ship, and after independent analysts spent days publicly tearing apart the fabricated footage that supposedly proved it. It tells you this wasn't really about achieving a specific tactical outcome anymore. It had become something closer to an ongoing psychological campaign, a running argument Iran kept trying to win in the information space, even after losing it decisively in the actual physical one. That's actually the exact dynamic that a number of defense analysts have pointed to when trying to explain why Iran keeps circling back to this specific target obsessively throughout the war. One detailed analysis on this exact question framed it as Iran's persistent fixation on destroying a U.S. aircraft carrier not being simple theatrical propaganda, but a calculated asymmetric strategy aimed at what's described as a psychological center of gravity rather than a purely military one. The argument goes like this: sinking a Nimitz or Gerald Ford-class supercarrier is operationally close to impossible given the layered defenses these ships travel with. But Tehran understands that even visible damage, a fire, a listing hull, a plume of smoke that goes viral before anyone can fact-check it, generates a strategic shock completely disproportionate to whatever the actual operational loss would be. So the entire question shifts away from can Iran actually destroy this ship, and toward can Iran make enough people believe, even briefly, that it did. Judged by that standard, the March 1st claim, however quickly and thoroughly it got debunked, briefly succeeded, racking up millions of views across 5 or 6 languages, before USS Central Command and independent fact-checkers managed to catch up with the narrative and correct the record. Let's also be fair about what Iran actually does have in its arsenal when it comes to anti-ship capability, because dismissing the entire threat as pure fantasy would be its own kind of oversimplification. Reports throughout this war have detailed Iran's development of long-range weapons, specifically built with naval targets in mind, including the Abu Mahdi cruise missile, which reportedly carries a range of around 1,000 kilometers, along with several systems described as hypersonic in nature. Beyond the missile side, Iran has also invested heavily in swarm tactics, small fast attack boats combined with suicide drones that are designed specifically to overwhelm a carrier group's point defense systems through sheer volume rather than any single weapon's individual sophistication. The real limiting factor for Iran, according to military analysts who've studied this specific problem closely, isn't the weapons themselves, it's the targeting chain behind them. Hitting a fixed target like a building or an airbase is a fundamentally different problem than hitting a carrier group that's constantly changing course, screened by escort ships, and covered by its own airborne radar. To reliably strike a moving target like that, you need a persistent, real-time stream of tracking data from satellites or long-range radar that can keep updating a missile's targeting solution all the way through its flight, and Iran's sensor and networking capability, according to the people who study this for a living, simply isn't there yet, even if its raw missile technology keeps improving year over year. So what's the actual most likely outcome if Iran ever does get lucky enough to land a hit on an American vessel in this theater? The consensus among analysts who've looked closely at this question isn't that Iran will suddenly sink a supercarrier. It's that Iran might eventually manage to damage something smaller and less protected, an escort destroyer running picket duty on the edge of the formation, or logistics and resupply vessel operating further from the carrier's own defensive umbrella. That would still be a genuinely serious escalation with real casualties attached to it, but it's a fundamentally different outcome than the one Khamenei promised in that February 17th post, and a very different outcome than the one Iran's own state media tried to convince the world had already happened back on March 1st. There's an international dimension to this specific threat worth unpacking too, because Khamenei's warning didn't happen in a diplomatic vacuum. It came with at least some quiet backing from outside Iran's own borders. Around the same period Iranian officials were making these carrier threats, Russia was publicly reaffirming its support for what it called a diplomatic solution, while simultaneously backing Iran's rights under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, giving Tehran a degree of diplomatic cover on the broader nuclear standoff, even as its own military rhetoric kept escalating toward direct threats against American naval assets. That combination, quiet great power backing on the diplomatic track paired with increasingly aggressive military rhetoric aimed at a specific symbolic target like an aircraft carrier, is a pattern that's shown up repeatedly throughout this war. Iran testing how far it can push the confrontational side of its posture while still keeping at least one foot in the diplomatic door through partners like Moscow. It's also worth going deeper into exactly why the defensive architecture around a modern carrier strike group makes an actual successful strike this difficult. Because understanding the layers involved tells you why every single verified attempt against the Lincoln failed, while the unverified ones had to be manufactured entirely out of recycled footage. A carrier never actually operates alone. It travels at the center of what's called a strike group, typically built around several Arleigh Burke class-guided missile destroyers equipped with the Aegis combat system, a networked radar and missile defense architecture specifically designed to detect, track, and intercept incoming threats from dozens of miles out. Layered on top of that, the carrier itself typically has E-2D Hawkeye airborne early warning aircraft flying constant orbits overhead, giving the entire formation radar coverage that extends well beyond what any single ship could provide on its own. And behind all of that sits the kind of space-based detection the Lexington Institute analysis specifically pointed to, U.S. Enforcement Space Force systems, built to detect the infrared heat signature of a ballistic missile the moment it leaves its launch rail, long before that missile has even settled into its flight trajectory. Put all three of those layers together, satellite detection at the moment of launch, airborne radar tracking throughout the missile's flight, and shipboard interceptors capable of engaging in the final seconds before impact, and you get a defensive system that's specifically built around the assumption that someone, someday, exactly like Iran in this case, is going to try precisely this kind of attack. That's precisely why the entire episode ended up being such a clean, almost textbook case study in the difference between wartime propaganda and wartime reality. Every actual missile Iran fired in the direction of the Lincoln got tracked from launch, correctly assessed as not posing a genuine threat to the ship, and confirmed by CENTCOM to have not even come close, while every viral claim of a successful strike turned out to rely on footage that had nothing to do with the actual event being described, whether that was old video game clips or unrelated footage more than a year old. There was no murky middle ground here, no genuinely ambiguous near miss that honest observers could reasonably disagree about. It was a clean split between verified failure on the actual battlefield and fabricated success in the information space, which makes this particular thread of the war an unusually clear window into exactly how that gap between rhetoric and reality gets manufactured and sustained. This entire carrier saga also has to be understood against the much larger war it was embedded inside, because the fixation on sinking the Lincoln was really just one especially vivid thread running through a conflict that ended up reshaping the entire region. Operation Epic Fury, the campaign that opened with Khamenei's killing, ran from February 28th all the way through early May, and what started as a targeted operation aimed at Iran's nuclear program and its top leadership expanded into a sprawling multi-front war touching nearly every country bordering the Persian Gulf. An interim ceasefire eventually got signed months later, complete with detailed language committing Iran to arrange safe passage for commercial vessels through the strait for a defined window, and committing Tehran to future dialogue with Oman and other Gulf states about the long-term administration of that waterway. But that ceasefire, like so many other diplomatic arrangements throughout this war, proved fragile, and fighting resumed not long after, dragging the conflict on for months past what anyone initially expected, back when Trump himself was telling reporters the whole thing would likely take about 4 weeks. It's also worth remembering that the fixation on the Lincoln wasn't happening in isolation. It was unfolding right alongside a genuinely massive regional crisis centered on the Strait of Hormuz itself. That crisis, which kicked off the same day as the opening strikes back on February 28th, eventually produced a global fuel crisis, triggered a sustained American aerial campaign against Iranian targets strung along the strait, led to a full naval blockade of Iran, and forced the formation of an entirely new multinational body called the Persian Gulf Strait Authority, just to manage safe passage through the waterway. The human toll from that specific crisis, separate from the direct war casualties in Bahrain and the UAE, included one tugboat sunk outright, at least 17 merchant ships damaged, with 7 of those abandoned by their crews entirely, 2 merchant vessels captured outright, 12 seafarers killed or reported missing, and a port worker killed along with 2 more wounded in Bahrain specifically. Every one of those numbers represents a completely ordinary working person, a merchant sailor, a tugboat crew member, a dock worker, caught up in a conflict that had nothing to do with them personally, killed or endangered simply because they happened to be moving cargo or working a shift in exactly the waterway both sides decided to turn into a battlefield. And that's really the pattern worth sitting with, as this entire episode gets tied together. Iran's supreme leader made an extraordinarily specific, extraordinarily public threat, promising to sink an American warship if war broke out. War broke out less than 2 weeks later, and the very first thing that happened wasn't a successful strike on that ship. It was the death of the man who made the threat in the first place. Iran's military and state media apparatus then spent the following weeks trying to retroactively make that promise true through increasingly threadbare claims, fabricated footage recycled from old video games, unrelated clips more than a year old pulled from unrelated conflicts entirely, and vague, undetailed assertions from state television with nothing behind them. And even after every single one of those claims got publicly and thoroughly debunked by the very people whose job it is to verify exactly this kind of wartime claim, Iran's own Navy chief came back out a month later and made essentially the same threat all over again, as if the previous month of embarrassment simply hadn't happened. That persistence, more than any single claim to strike, is probably the most revealing detail in this entire story. It tells you the carrier threat was never really about the Abraham Lincoln specifically, or even about the U.S. Navy specifically. It was about maintaining a specific image of strength and defiance for a domestic Iranian audience and a broader international one, an image that needed constant reinforcement precisely because the actual underlying military reality kept refusing to cooperate with it. Every time the fabricated footage got debunked, every time CENTCOM issued another flat denial, the pressure to reassert the original threat in some new form only grew stronger, because backing down from it entirely would have meant conceding publicly that the promise made by a supreme leader who'd just been killed carrying it out was never actually achievable to begin with. There's also a broader lesson here about how modern warfare actually gets fought and perceived that extends well past this one specific carrier story. In a conflict this saturated with social media, viral footage, and instant global sharing across dozens of languages, the gap between what actually happens on the water and what millions of people briefly believe happened on the water can be enormous. And that gap itself becomes a genuine weapon, one that doesn't require a single functioning missile to use effectively. Iran understood that dynamic well enough to exploit it within 24 hours of the war's opening strikes, and the fact that the fabricated Lincoln footage still managed to circulate for days across multiple continents and languages before getting definitively corrected shows just how effective that kind of information warfare can be, even when the underlying claim turns out to be completely false. None of that changes the actual military balance sitting underneath all of this rhetoric, though. Throughout the entire war that followed those opening strikes, no credible, independently verified evidence has ever emerged of an American aircraft carrier actually being struck by Iranian forces, despite months of continued fighting, a formally reconstituted naval blockade, and repeated Iranian threats to make good on exactly that outcome. The Abraham Lincoln kept operating in the region, replenishing at sea, running its air wing, functioning exactly the way a carrier strike group is designed to function under sustained threat, precisely because the layered defensive architecture built around it, the escort ships, the airborne radar, the space-based launch detection, performed exactly the way it was designed to perform every single time Iran actually tried to test it. There's one more piece of this worth dwelling on, the swarm tactic side of Iran's approach, because it's genuinely different in character from the ballistic missile claims and deserves to be understood on its own terms. Where a ballistic missile strike against a carrier is a single, high-value shot that either lands or doesn't, swarm tactics work on an entirely different logic. Dozens of small, fast attack boats and suicide drones approaching from multiple directions simultaneously, specifically designed to overwhelm the number of interceptors a point defense system can fire in a short window, rather than trying to beat that system through stealth or speed alone. It's a strategy built around exhausting a defender's magazine rather than outmaneuvering their sensors. And it's one of the reasons Iran has continued investing heavily in cheap, mass-producible drones and small craft, even while its longer-range missile and hypersonic programs continue developing in parallel. The theory has real merit in a purely numbers-driven sense. If you can force a carrier group's escorts to expend enough interceptors, fending off a large enough wave of cheap threats, you create an opening, however brief, for something more sophisticated to slip through afterward. But translating that theory into an actual successful engagement against a fully alert, fully defended carrier strike group operating in open water remains a completely different challenge than swarming a stationary target or an unprotected commercial vessel, which is exactly the kind of target Iran's forces have had far more demonstrated success against throughout this war. Hence, all those merchant ships damaged, captured, and abandoned across the broader Strait of Hormuz crisis. That contrast actually tells you something important about calibrating Iran's threats going forward. And it's worth carrying with you the next time a headline claims some dramatic new escalation against American naval assets in this theater. Iran has repeatedly proven it can inflict real damage against soft targets, merchant tankers, tugboats, fixed installations on land, civilian infrastructure in countries hosting American bases. It has not, at any verified point in this entire war, managed to land a confirmed hit against a defended U.S. Navy warship, let alone an aircraft carrier traveling with its full escort group. That gap between demonstrated capability against undefended targets and complete failure against defended ones is the single most important piece of context for evaluating literally any future claim that emerges from Tehran about a successful strike on American naval power, because the track record so far points overwhelmingly in one direction: threats followed by failed attempts, followed by fabricated claims meant to paper over that failure. It's also worth thinking about what this specific pattern means for how ordinary people watching this war from a distance should actually process the claims coming out of it going forward. The March 1st episode with the Lincoln wasn't a one-off fluke of viral misinformation. It's become something closer to a recurring feature of how this entire conflict gets experienced by anyone following it online rather than through official military channels. A claim goes out, often paired with dramatic footage, gets shared rapidly across multiple languages and platforms before anyone has a chance to verify it. And only later, sometimes days later, does the actual verification process catch up and either confirm or debunk what millions of people have already seen and in many cases already believed. That lag between viral spread and verified fact is precisely the terrain Iran's information strategy around the carrier threat was built to exploit. And it's worth remembering that the same dynamic doesn't just apply to claims coming out of Tehran. It applies to essentially every dramatic wartime claim circulating from any source throughout this entire conflict, which is exactly why waiting for an official denial or confirmation from a body like CENTCOM before treating any viral footage as settled fact has become such an essential habit for anyone trying to actually understand what's happening in this war, rather than just reacting to whatever's trending in the moment. Bring all of that together, and the arc of this specific story ends up telling you something bigger than just what happened to one aircraft carrier over one particular week in March. It's a story about the enormous gap that can open up between a threat and its execution, about how quickly a regime can lose the very leader who made a promise before that promise ever gets tested, and about how far fabricated footage can travel before the truth manages to catch up with it. Khamenei made that threat on February 17th, believing, presumably, that it would serve as a deterrent, a signal of resolve strong enough to make Washington think twice about the naval buildup already underway. Instead, it became one of the last major public statements of his life, And the war that followed turned his specific promise into a months-long exercise in exactly the opposite outcome he intended: repeated failed attempts, repeated fabricated claims, and a Navy chief still making the same threat all over again a full month after the world had already thoroughly debunked the first attempt to fulfill it. So if you're looking for the single clearest summary of what actually happened after Iran threatened to sink a U.S. carrier, it's this. The man who made the threat was killed within 11 days by the very war his own words helped set the stage for. The military campaign that followed tried repeatedly, through both genuine missile launches and fabricated media claims, to make that specific threat come true, and every single verified attempt failed completely, while the unverified ones turned out to be recycled footage from video games and unrelated years-old conflicts. And rather than abandon the threat after month of failure and embarrassment, Iran's leadership simply kept repeating it, because the promise itself had become more important to maintain publicly than the reality of whether it could ever actually be fulfilled. That's not really a story about naval warfare at all in the end. It's a story about the distance that can open up between what a regime says it's capable of and what it can actually deliver, and about how far that gap can be papered over, at least for a little while, with a viral video and a defiant quote from a Navy chief who should probably already know better by now. If this breakdown helped you understand how far that specific threat actually traveled from Khamenei's original post all the way through the fabricated footage and the repeated follow-up warnings, drop a comment with what you think Iran's actual strategy is here, whether you think this is genuine military ambition that just hasn't succeeded yet, or whether you think it's always been closer to pure psychological theater aimed at an audience that was never going to fact-check the footage in real time anyway. If you want to catch the next update the moment there's a real, verified development in this specific standoff between Iranian rhetoric and American naval defenses, go ahead and subscribe so it lands in front of you right away. And if you know someone who's still out there sharing that old fabricated footage of the Lincoln supposedly on fire, do them a favor and send this their way. Because understanding exactly how that claim traveled, from a real supreme leader's real threat, to a real war, to a completely fake video with unrealistic visual elements pulled from an old video game, is exactly the kind of context that keeps people from getting fooled the next time a similar claim starts spreading. Thanks for sticking with this one all the way through, and we'll see you in the next one.